Shockwaves from Stonewall, Gay Liberation in Michigan.
So my talk today is Shockwaves from Stonewall, Gay Liberation in Michigan. As you can see, I don't have a script. For these kind of talks, I just kind of like to go by what, the structure is structured by the time we have and what shows up on the slide. I mean, I do have some things I want to cover, clearly, but it's a little looser. I do have an article that was published in Between the Lines, June 6th issue that goes into more depth. It's a little less rough around the edges than this talk will be. I have a few copies of it here, and if we run out, I also can send you a PDF of it if you're interested. So just let me know. So to kind of orient ourselves and kind of set the stage, I need to do a little bit of LGBTQ history 101 and bring us back to the Lavender Scare. So, Stonewall is kind of this turning point, maybe, in LGBTQ history. But, back in the early 1950s, after World War II, we had this period called the Lavender Scare, where the federal government actually targeted individuals who were employed by the federal government who were homosexual. The idea was that one pervert could contaminate an entire office. So a mere accusation could kind of damage you. And this had ramifications not just in federal employment, but in other ways across the country. At the time, homosexuality was considered criminal by most statutes. Homosexual acts were. Psychiatry viewed it as a mental illness, and organized religion, by and large, viewed it as a sin. So on the local level, this was often seen manifested in arrests. So, I've found thousands of men in Metro Detroit in my history of research of Metro Detroit who were arrested on various homosexual charges. Women far less. Those records don't survive that they were. When women were arrested, they were often arrested on charges having to do with gender transgression. But they would raid bars or they would come through bars, but mostly it was one-on-one stuff. So in Detroit, this was a big issue. It was also an issue on college campuses. At the University of Michigan, there were major crackdowns in the late 1950s and early 1960s where men were arrested. One man in a crackdown at U of M committed suicide. This is the write-up in the Michigan Daily at the time. And this is a document from the Michigan State University archives that shows a student who was arrested and then forced to name names. So, the people who were adamantly against homosexual visibility and people who they felt could contaminate not just one office, but all of society, were very fierce in kind of their targeting. And I'll mention Esther Newton again. She has a marvelous memoir where she describes her experience at the University of Michigan and her altercation with the Dean of Women at the time. The other thing that her memoir does, though, is it also shows that there was a rich life and there were ways for people to meet, whether it be bars or social networks and such. So the 1950s are important to remember, for the oppression that people experienced, but also for ways in which people who we would now identify as LGBTQ kind of showed agency. They kind of took control of their lives and sought each other out. And one person that I want to highlight is the experience of Christine Jorgensen. So when Christine Jorgensen went to Europe and had what was framed in the headlines as a sex change, it was the first time that many Americans could read about this in the press and understand this as an option and an opportunity. So it was kind of earth-shaking in that respect. It would be another decade and a half before such procedures and such sensitivity was available in the United States, but kind of the ground was being laid. And the ground was being laid in terms of activism in the 1950s and 60s by a number of small, usually based in large cities, organizations, and part of what was known as the homophile movement. So starting in 1950 with the Mattachine Society, 1955 with the Daughters of Bilitis, and the inauguration of One magazine, which was distributed nationally, lesbians, gay men, bi men started to assert themselves and make themselves present and try to, push for change in ways that would ultimately be profound. And much of this movement would be forgotten or kind of minimized once Stonewall happened and there was a mass movement underway. But it's important for us to remember that this happened. So One magazine started in 1953, and by the mid-1960s, they're actually, the Mattachine Society of Washington is staging direct action pickets on Independence Hall, on the White House. That's kind of pushing the bar and being visible and getting media coverage. Now, I do want to say every one of these slides, I could probably talk for 15 or 20 minutes about each. So I'm just going to rush along and give a little bit of the background about how the homophile movement kind of showed itself in Michigan. So there was a chapter of the Mattachine Society in Detroit that lasted 17 months from August of 58 to March of 1960. It never had more than a dozen members, and it was very, these guys were very fearful. It was guys. These were all white men in their 20s and 30s. The three key members were all graduates of Wayne State, so they were middle class. But they were fearful for their jobs. They were fearful of being exposed. And since Julie Harada's here and she's the curator of the Labadie collection, I should note that the records of the Detroit Mattachine chapter are in the Labadie collection. These two gentlemen, Hal Lawson and David Brewer, donated their papers to Labadie. And here and there, I'm going to kind of talk process a little bit, because I think it's important to know that this history isn't just magically understood, that it needs to be preserved and then uncovered and discovered in ways that I'm happy to talk about during the Q&A, but I just want to make note of that. So it was another 5 years before there would be another organization in Detroit, and it was a chapter of One Incorporated, which published One, and its founder was a man named Chet Sampson, who for years I had two names. I had Chuck Thompson and Chet Sampson. I didn't know which was the real name. A dilemma in doing queer history. And I finally found out it was Chet Sampson. I found a Chet Sampson in LA and used my tax refund money to go talk to him. And he was very generous. He was in his mid-80s by this time, so his memories weren't precise, but there was kind of this nod of okay to tell his story. And he had been a high school teacher in Grosse Pointe, and then later became a travel agent. And it was through his travel agency that he used that as an umbrella for places to meet. Now, he lived in Los Angeles, so for the first couple years, One only met when he was in town. So at some point on a quarterly basis, but then some local folks started taking advantage of it. It pushed the bar beyond what the earlier Mattachine chapter was able to do, in that they started doing outreach. They engaged in local clergy. They had some publicity in the Detroit News. And as this flyer shows, 2 weeks before Stonewall, they had a gay day at Cedar Point. 2 weeks later, things erupted at the Stonewall Inn in New York's Greenwich Village. A quick thumbnail was that a routine bar raid of an unlicensed gay establishment, mafia run, led to several nights of rioting. People pushed back, they're not going to take it anymore. There's just a rich, deep history of the importance of this event. Now, there had been prior events, but this was in New York, the media capital of the country. You know, prior events had had, you know, dozens of people protesting. This had a couple thousands of people in the streets, you know, fighting back. And it galvanized kind of some new activism that kind of turned the page on, you know, this more moderate, careful, hesitant activism of the homophile movement. Now, I want to give a plug for my friend Mark Stein's new book, Stonewall, A Documentary History, which is mainly primary sources from the era, both before Stonewall, then of Stonewall, the bar and the event itself, and then kind of the 4 years afterwards. So I would highly recommend it. This being a library, I would highly recommend that the library purchase it. So kind of the significance is not just kind of that queer people finally fought back, but that this inspired kind of a new wave of activism known as gay liberation. So within weeks, the New York Gay Liberation Front was founded, and this was a much more in-your-face brand of activism. And we should remember and note gay liberation for several achievements. One was kind of a new definition of what it meant to be out or to come out. So before Stonewall, you generally, if you were queer, what we might call queer, big umbrella, you would come out into the gay world. And after Stonewall, coming out meant coming out to everybody, your folks, your coworkers, your neighbors, to the world, coming out in the newspaper. So that was like a major, major step. Another major point about gay liberation that we're going to talk about in terms of Michigan is that it sparked a mass movement. You know, no longer these organizations that only had a dozen or a few dozen, or maybe, you know, in New York and San Francisco, several hundred people involved. You now had lots of organizations across the country. And in 1973, an achievement of gay liberation can be pointed to was that the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of diagnostic and statistical manual, its list of mental disorders. So it was no longer considered a sickness by the mental health professionals. And, you know, as the Chicago Gay Crusader cheekily said, you know, 20 million gay people suddenly cured. So in Michigan, the ball got rolling in January 1970 with the first meeting of the Detroit Gay Liberation Front. And for this, kind of his experience with the early origins, I want to kind of defer to Ann Arbor's own Jim Toy. So this is from the website Outwards. There's another Toy clip, but I want to have Jim tell his story.
I was typing up the Sunday church bulletin in December of 1969, and on the calendar, I see a note that says gay meeting. So I go to the priest, the third radical priest. We called him Daddy-O. And said, Daddy-O, what is this gay meeting thing? And he said, he was a great big guy with a big deep voice, I don't know what it is. One of the guys in the draft resistance group said, could we have a gay meeting here? And I said, well, whatever that is, if we can't have a gay meeting here, we might as well shut this God box down. So I said, thank you, from the depths of my closet. I go back to typing. I get done. I drive back to Ann Arbor. I immediately run down to the gay bar. And there's my good buddy, John. John, there's something very strange going on at the God box. What? A gay meeting. What's that? Well, we didn't know. There never had been in Michigan an open, above ground, advertised, quote, gay meeting. Are we going to go? Oh. And we ambivalated about that for a month. We get together. Are we going to go? Yes, no. So the night before the meeting, we get together at the bar. Are we going to go to this meeting? And we looked at each other and simultaneously said, ugh, if we go, that means we're gay. Well, the next day, by karma or whatever, we get into John's car and we drive into the meeting. There we find a dozen other women and men just as excited and scared and confused as we were.
So, gay lib in Detroit was a new phenomenon. It was in your face, it was disruptive, and kind of thanks to Bishop Richard Emmerich, it got some publicity. Within a few months, they had been meeting at St. Joseph's Episcopal Church in Detroit for several months until the bishop decided that they shouldn't be having a gay group on church property. So he kicked them out. And one of the parishioners at St. Joseph then opened her house on California Street in Detroit for gay lib meetings. So it continued to meet. Its first public protest was at Christ Church in Cranbrook, where Bishop Emmerich was holding Mother's Day service. And then that fall, they disrupted the Episcopal Convention, both kind of in a protest at noon mass and then in the afternoon session where they demanded to speak. And one of these has a good, so this is Jim Toy right here. They demanded to let Jim Toy speak, and they immediately adjourned the whole convention. The Detroit GLF also started the first gay newspaper in Michigan, the Gay Liberator, and within a few months of the Detroit chapter being founded, or the Detroit organization, a gay liberation front in Ann Arbor was started, and immediately became kind of, went head to head with the highest levels of the administration at the university. So here's Jim again from a different website called Outspoken that Eric Marcus has put together, and I'll turn it over to Jim again.
We wanted to have a statewide, quote, gay conference. And we went to a secretary in student affairs and said, how do we get space for a conference? Well, you write me a memo, which we did. And then president of the University of Michigan, Robin Fleming, sent the Gay Liberation Front a formal letter saying, I forbid use of University of Michigan facilities and other resources for this gathering. It would not be educational, and we would have to have police presence on campus. So I took the letter to the next meeting of the Gay Liberation Front. I read it out, and one of the guys who'd been coming to the meetings said, forget him. He hauled out a bunch of keys, peeled off one key, handed it to me, and said, have your conference. This is the key to the student activities building. So we did. And the university sent a spy. I think they were not aware that the spy was an ally. The spy wrote a report to the administration of the University of Michigan saying, at your request, I went to this conference. The energy was low, the numbers were small. If you ignore these people, they'll disappear. And we determined that he was on our side and was trying to get the administration off our backs. So the secretary, who had said to me, write a memo if you want space for a conference, I ran into the secretary at the Michigan Union. The secretary said, Jim, there is an office here for black students, and they have paid staff. There is an office for women students, and they have paid staff. Don't you guys want an office with paid staff? And I said, I don't know. I'll go and ask the Gay Liberation Front. So I did. And they looked at me and said, are you crazy? Of course we want an office. Go get it. So I went to the secretary and said, yes, we would like an office. Thank you for the suggestion. What do we do? Secretary said, write me a memo. Well, this memo had a more positive effect than the first one. We know what bureaucratic time is. It was a nanosecond, to use that term. In about 6 months, the university created for us what they called the Human Sexuality Office. They were not about to use the words gay or lesbian or homosexual in a formal title. And they gave us a small space, maybe 8 by 10, and a file cabinet, a desk, and 2 chairs, and hired myself and a lesbian named Cynthia, Cindy for short, Cynthia Gair, Gair, to serve as the co-coordinators of the group. We had said in our memo to the university, if you would create an office for us, we don't want to be called directors or anything formal like that. We want to be referred to as co-coordinators. So they hired Cindy and myself at quarter-time salaries, and we opened up in the fall of 1971.
And lo and behold, the University of Michigan became the first university in the country to have such an office. And part of the importance of this is kind of institutional stability, because while a lot of gay lib groups were formed on college campuses, we know that student groups can come and go, and this provided some level of continuity over time. So I'm going to jump ahead a year or two to 1972, April, where Jerry DeGreek and Nancy Weschler ran for city council on the Human Rights Party. Now, Jerry DeGreek was the fellow who gave the keys to the Student Activities Building. And Nancy Weschler, over time, would become involved in a group called Gay Awareness Women's Collective, with a K, GAWK. K as in they would use America with a K to kind of critique American imperialism and capitalism and such. So they were elected, they weren't out when they were elected to city council, but in 1972, they were elected to city council. And while they were on that first year on council, they helped steer Ann Arbor to become the first city in the country to pass a non-discrimination ordinance that covered the city and banned discrimination based on sexual preference, the term used at the time. They also managed to push through a provision to declare a week in June as Gay Pride Week. So it was one of the first Gay Pride Weeks in the country. I should note, because I straddle between teaching at Michigan State University and having gotten my bachelor's from the University of Michigan, there's some kind of rivalry, I understand. So there's, East Lansing was the first municipality in the country to pass protections in city hiring, a major kind of milestone. But their ordinance didn't come until later in 1973, after an extended battle. Ann Arbor was the first one to pass an ordinance, and as we'll see a little bit later, Detroit was the first one to include protections within its city charter. So in this respect, all 3 cities in Michigan and Michigan South was kind of on the vanguard of kind of pushing for these kind of legal changes. So let's go back to Nancy Weschler and Jerry DeGreek. So they're serving on council. They're in their second year on council in the fall of 1973, and the ordinance is in place, but the owner of a bar called the Rubaiyat won't let women dance together. So GAWK decides to protest it. And at a city council meeting, Nancy Weschler is demanding that the chief of police enforce this new ordinance. And he's being resistant and intransigent about that, and so she comes out as lesbian. And Jerry, wanting to be supportive and in solidarity, came out as gay. So they were the first out public officials in the country, but they weren't elected as out queer people. That claim to fame goes to Kathy Kozachenko, who in April 1974 was elected to the Ann Arbor City Council as an out lesbian. And she was the first openly queer person in the US to be elected to public office. So Elaine Noble would be elected in Massachusetts a few months later. And then lots of people think Harvey Milk was the first one in the country. It would be another 3 years for Harvey to be elected to the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco. So again, Michigan kind of on the vanguard. So I want to jump back to the kinds of things that Gay Lib was doing in terms of direct action and protest. This is a protest of the Gay Liberation Front in Detroit, protesting the police in Detroit, the Murphy Hall of Justice, the entrapment cases that have been going on for decades. Now, I want to stress this moment because this led to some important divisions within the early gay movement. And it was not just characteristic in Michigan, but nationwide as well. When they were planning this protest, the members of what became known as the Third World Caucus of the Detroit GLF wanted them to address police harassment and intimidation in the long history against African Americans and kind of the racism within the police department. And some members of the Detroit GLF thought that was a great idea, but the majority kind of said, no, this needs to be a gay-only protest. So this led to a major rift within the Detroit GLF in which most of the people of color left. So, and in many ways, that kind of chasm and kind of the, we're talking about the shockwaves from Stonewall here, but many people in Detroit, people of color in particular, but not exclusively, were also still experiencing the shockwaves of 1967, the Detroit Rebellion. And I don't think everyone who was involved in Gay Lib fully understood that. But they're also kind of having some disagreement and tension having to do with not following kind of traditional gender norms. The terms that were used at the time had to do with transvestism. And this is A. Michael Warner, also known as Sabrina, and this is one of those cases where I don't, I haven't been able to find this person. I've been trying. I'm still trying. But she wrote some important critiques in the Gay Liberator about how gay liberation was treating what we would now call transgender people, and kind of asserting herself and kind of demanding a space and a place within the movement. And in some respects, there was some kind of action on behalf of groups of people that would fall in the trans category now. This is from 1972. There was a protest of Gay Lib at the Flame Bar because the Flame would not allow cross-dressers. Now, we need to be careful about conflating cross-dressing per se with people who are experiencing kind of trans lives. But the understandings at the time, in some ways, were still kind of being worked through and tentative. But many people who saw themselves as not being conforming in terms of traditional gender expectations found a home within the gay movement, but it was not a full embrace. There were lots of people who were kind of cold. Shoshana, did you want to?
Is that where Logan is?
Pardon?
Is that where Logan is now?
I believe so. And then another important point to make here about kind of what was going on early on within gay lib is there was a big push to repeal the sodomy law in Michigan. And one of the state reps named Bob Traxler proposed a bill to decriminalize sodomy and make sexual interactions between adults legal. And the coalition of gay lib groups also wanted them to repeal laws against cross-dressing. And when they wouldn't, they protested at the Capitol and refused to support the bill as it was. So some of the additional ripples about gay lib, the Gay Liberation Front of Detroit didn't last much beyond late 1971. But one of the outcomes was, their Christian caucus formed the basis for the Metropolitan Community Church of Detroit, which had a special outreach to the gay community. And MCC Detroit, 47 years later, is still meeting. And there's kind of this additional ripple of not just at U of M, but at campuses throughout the state, including at Grand Valley, including at Central Michigan, including at Eastern Michigan. There were GLFs that were popping up. These are some photos of the Wayne State GLF that I recently found this fellow, and he shared them with me. The photo I'm more familiar with, and the Wayne GLF was separate from the Detroit GLF, founded in the fall of 1971. This is a fruit cart that the Wayne GLF set up on campus to sell apples to raise money for the first ever Pride celebration in Michigan called Christopher Street, Detroit. Now, one of the keys about understanding Stonewall and why it's important is that they remembered it a year later with a march and rally in New York, but also in Chicago and LA. So it was already seen as kind of having national significance. It was another 3 years before Detroit would join in this, and other states over time, clearly that's what we're doing this month is commemorative. So Christopher Street, Detroit was a week-long series of events that included a dance, the screening of a camp film called Trisha's Wedding that was a takeoff on the president's daughter getting married, and the opening of Detroit's first community center, Green Carnation Center, which was on Virginia Park, and the first march. About 200 people had a lane or two of Woodward Avenue, and they marched from Cass Park, Capitol Park. The one by Temple is Cass Park, and then to Kennedy Square, where they held a rally and got front page coverage in the paper, and kind of broke the ice in terms of being really public and drawing kind of people to kind of participate. So one of the speakers, and the only lesbian to speak at the first Pride rally, was Susan Swope, who wrote in the Gay Liberator under the name Susan Williamson, so it was another tricky person to track down. So this is from an oral history I did with Susan, where she talks about speaking at the rally. And she came out as a lesbian within kind of the socialist movement and then the early feminist movement while she was still married. So that's a little context for her remarks here. June of 1969.
I remember when we were planning this march, I delivered a speech. And I remember as I was anticipating giving this speech, thinking, this speech could be on TV. And Michael's parents could see me on TV. And that's how Michael's parents would find out that I'm a lesbian. But I thought, I just have to do it. It's important. And if that happens, it happens. And I remember standing up there and delivering that speech and being really nervous. But of course, in the event, what got on TV was the drag queens. That's who always gets on TV when you have a gay march.
And here they are. They were representing Lansing. They rode the hood of this Ford. Now, when they were planning the whole march, they felt they needed somebody to serve as protection. And they first went to the leather community and found that these guys were teachers and architects and lawyers, wanted nothing to do with the gay march. So what Susan refers to as drag queens, some of them were professional impersonators, some not, took part. And they rode the hood of this Ford, and what happened in the middle of the march is the driver slammed on the brakes, and they all tumbled to the pavement, and that's what was on TV. So the week of events also included a picnic at Palmer Park, a gay be-in or a gay-in, and inevitably when I interview older gay men about this time period and earlier, well, there weren't any women around. Full feathers. This is Marilee Melvin, whose T-shirt is currently on display at the Detroit Historical Museum. They're having their first ever exhibit to mark Stonewall 50, kind of taking advantage of this. The T-shirt is on display right now, and here's Susan again. So the rally also included one person of color named Ken Dudley, who was a dynamic, amazing, crucial part of kind of this early movement, but because he died of AIDS in 1991 and didn't leave like records any place except for what was published, there's not so much that's known about him. But he was a really crucial person, and I want to read his remarks. He was the only person of color at the Pride rally. There are many black gays who are not marching with us today. That may be explained in part by the idea that black gay people march every day. If not by virtue of their gayness, then surely by virtue of their blackness. The black lesbian, for many, has been a symbol of the epitome of the struggle for human liberation in this society. The opposition to her right to self-expression and basic human rights are awesome. The black gay man or queen has within his multifaceted image the determination to demonstrate to everyone who sees him that in this decaying system of third world genocide, sexism, and capitalist exploitation, that he is going to make it, no matter what the odds. And the odds are great. Yes, black gays are entrapped just like whites, but no more often, or are we? When we as individual black gays stand in front of the traffic court judge, we receive the same injustice, or do we? Once busted for a gay offense, are we then busted for being black in America? Those of us who are marching here today, and those of us who march every day, know deep in our hearts that all anti-gay laws must be reformed, not be reformed, but repealed. And as black gays, we must all know that this exploitative system must also be repealed. And Ken Dudley, a couple years later, or a year later, in response to 5 African-American men who were murdered leaving gay bars in Detroit, founded a group called the Black Association of Gays, which was the first known formal organization for African-Americans in Detroit and Michigan. It lasted at least through 1975. But again, this is the dilemma. We don't have records of the organization. And the other person that was involved was a woman named Ann Lewis, which is too common a name to really track down easily. And the phone number that was given for the group was a work number in the Department of Social Services. So there's still leads to track, but it's not easy history to find. Also kind of coming out of this was a radio program called Gaily Speaking. 88 of the programs survive in audio. The tapes are available at the Bentley Historical Library. I think they've now been fully digitized. And if you Google Gaily Speaking WDET did a special programming related to its 40th anniversary in 2013. I just talked to someone Thursday who remembers listening to it as a teenager at 13 on his transistor radio under his pillow. And think about that in terms of finding community and, you know, the ways in which, you know, these early activists were being creative in figuring out how to reach out. Talk a little bit about MSU's Gay Lib, you know, to be a little fair. One of their great disruptions was they helped precipitate the shutdown of Grand River Avenue for like 3 days in 1972 in a major anti-war rally. And the way they did this is one of the members, you know, pretended like he lost a contact and was like on the street, and the other people, oh, he lost a contact, he lost a contact. And more people were crowding around, and pretty soon they all just sat down. And kind of this photo is evidence of the gay role in kind of this larger movement against the Vietnam War. And I love that the state trooper just happened to, you know, want to rest himself by the gay power spray paint. In 1972, the vice president of the university refused to let Gay Lib display a banner at the Abbott Street entrance. There's some language he used that I probably shouldn't use in a public library, but a year later, they were able to hang it. You know, they went through the bureaucracy that Jim Toy talked about and got permission, and it got stolen. But they were parked right nearby and ready with a replacement banner. And also in Lansing, so this is off campus, they opened a community center and started a newspaper called Gay Sunshine. And so this was a community center on Pennsylvania. The house no longer exists, and it only lasted about 6 months, but it still kind of shows the kind of vision that people had back then. And then this, at 1111 Prospect, both of these images are images I recently found and was just like, had to include and talk about. This was a lesbian commune. And I just met and talked with, for the article in Between the Lines, one of the residents of this commune. What I found going through the Sunshine newspaper was a reference to a new lesbian organization called the Purple Perils. So, and it gave this address, so I only had the address to go by, but I found a name and talked to Trudy a couple weeks ago on the phone and included her story in this article. So this kind of brings us to kind of a turning point. So there was a point where gay liberation kind of dissipated. The energy of it, the forcefulness of it, the direction of it shifted. And John D'Amelio has kind of articulated this in important ways. There were kind of two strands that grew out of this early activism. One was kind of a lesbian-specific path that had more to do with culture and feminism and consciousness raising. And the other was a gay male rights-centered path that had to do with, you know, pushing for legal change and pursuing sex. So I want to go back and talk about some of the early origins of kind of the lesbian strand of this, which came out in some ways. There were women who had been involved in Gay Lib, but there were others who never were. Trudy Sapoli, who I mentioned, really didn't have much to do with gay liberation on campus, but she had a lot to do with the Women's Center. So this is a major conference in 1970, hosted by the National Organization for Women. One of the founders, and now this is the lack of script stuff. Betty Friedan, who was one of the founders of NOW, didn't want lesbians involved in the National Organization for Women. She thought it would taint the organization and everyone involved would be construed by society as lesbian. So she called the people pushing for lesbian inclusion the Lavender Menace. So at this major conference in 1970, a number of women with Lavender Menace t-shirts under their shirts or their garb kind of infiltrated this auditorium. The lights went out and the lights came back up and there were these the Lavender Menace t-shirts all around the auditorium, and they demanded a place and they demanded to speak. And it kind of led to further other kinds of inclusion, sometimes rocky over time, and the kind of the origins of the radical lesbians. So nationally, this group that didn't turn towards kind of lesbian-specific activism happened with the radical lesbians. And in Ann Arbor, this group of women, including Gail Rubin, kind of served as kind of the vanguard of this. Cindy Garr was also a radical lesbian, and Cindy was part of, this was the other co-coordinator of the Human Sexuality Office. She was interviewed for a 1977 pioneering documentary called Word Is Out, where they interviewed like 30 gay people to kind of give society a glimpse of what gay life was like. And in this documentary, Cindy talks about attending her first radical lesbian meeting.
And I walked into the room, and here I see this ring of women sitting around on the floor, and I look around, and there are, I could see one here, these women, these well-known women who I knew were in radical lesbians. So I knew that must be where I was, and I really freaked out. I sort of backed against the wall and felt like I was crawling around the edge of the room to sort of try and sit in the back. And everyone kind of turned around and smiled at me. A lot of them knew me. It's sort of like, aha. And I thought, no, wait, you don't understand. Well, it was this incredible night. And towards the end of the evening, I wasn't afraid of these people anymore. The other thing that happened was that I met this woman there. There was some party at Sue's house, her apartment. And all these women, it was the women who were in radical lesbians, and one by one they left, and I had decided that tonight was the night. I just loved her eyes, and I remember they reminded me of my dog Snooch's eyes. And so I told her that night, I said, you just have the most amazing eyes. They remind me of my dog's. And I guess she took it pretty well. She said, oh, well, thank you. And she said, well, you can either, if you want, I can give you a ride home, or if you want to stay here the night, you can do that. I said, well, I'll stay here. And very casual, very cool. And then we got into bed. And I'm lying there, and we're sort of lying on opposite sides of the bed. She mumbled something to me, and I couldn't really hear her. And then it registered. She asked me if I needed a pillow or what. And so I thought, aha. I said, well, I mean, we could share one. So that was what did it. Then we just.
And in Ann Arbor, for some women, the radical lesbians weren't radical enough, and there was a group called the Revolutionary Lesbians that formed and started a newspaper called Spectre, which is also in the Labadie collection and lasted 6 issues. So made a couple references to this group called the Michigan Gay Coalition, which had people from around the state, from different organizations. They helped plan the first march in Detroit, and then they also were involved in protests at the Capitol, and they had regular meetings. But it was largely male-dominated, And then there was this meeting in the fall of 1972, so after the march in Detroit, where women from the Purple Perils, women from the Radical Lesbians, and GOG, and people from around the state showed up at this meeting and kind of tilted the majority towards women, and they demanded to be heard, and they issued this statement. The sisters from Ann Arbor, East Lansing, East Lansing, Grand Rapids, and Detroit are unified in their strong convictions about protecting women's rights within this confederation. We are not going to allow the men to ignore our constituency. We can see no future in this confederation as long as sexist attitudes continue to exist. We are here today to voice our opinions and plans of action as women and lesbians. Our primary aim is to end sexist attitudes, especially here in the gay community. In order to support this confederation, you must join in our struggle to end this sexism. And sadly, the confederation unraveled shortly thereafter. So it's kind of this indication of kind of this rift that really came to the fore in the mid-70s. So women went off on their own, and in Detroit, they started a group called Sappho Sisters Rising, which met in a lesbian commune called Geneva House, and there's a photo I've been trying to find. Here in Ann Arbor, there was a bookstore called the Women's Bookstore that would not allow men at all and raised some controversy here in Ann Arbor. Her Shelf Bookstore in Highland Park was also kind of a major site. And these provided kind of an avenue to women's literature and poetry. They served as some kinds of community center. And they were also, in some cases, distribution points for women's music. Publications specifically that began include the Lesbian Connection out of East Lansing, which began in 1974 and is still being published. The Leaping Lesbian Collective in 1976 started the Leaping Lesbian here in Ann Arbor. And kind of venues for women's music emerged as well, including Poor Women's Paradise in Detroit that survived about a year as kind of a non-commercial site for women's music and art and poetry readings and so forth. And Denise Dors was the founder of this. And basically, you know, they used a storefront in Detroit, but over time the rent just became too prohibitive and kind of highlights the ways in which kind of income disparity between men and women kind of showed itself with what was possible for both strands. And then in Michigan, kind of what later became very controversial, the Michigan Women's Music Festival kind of became a national site for women around the country and around the world to gather. The first one was held in Mount Pleasant by some Central Michigan University students. This is a flyer for the first event. And in the documentary Radical Harmonies, one of the founders describes how it got started. So.
Excited by the idea of a 3-day outdoor festival, Lisa and Christy Vogel, along with Mary Kendig, set out to produce the Michigan Women's Music Festival, which first took place in 1976.
And I kept getting a lot of people saying, "You're nuts, you know, like we're in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. What we've done is thrown 1 or 2 good keggers." Don't you think it's time you had a change of life? We literally have a party at our house, stop the music right at the most exciting moment and pass the hat. We had no money. And so we went off to Champaign, and everybody's thinking, who are these women who are doing this big festival in Michigan? And we went there with a hand-drawn ditto master that we'd snuck into the university and done with a little, you know, like the little purple ink. And all the other producers, who at that point were taking themselves very seriously, were going, wait a minute, you're doing this big thing that we're all talking about. What's up with these ditto masters, you know? First festival was 3 days long, and there ended up being 2,000 women who came. Many more than we had imagined might come.
So the men and some women followed a more political path. The Gay Liberation Front in Detroit, in New York, had splintered, and some had formed a group called the Gay Activists Alliance, and with the idea that they would pursue gay-only causes and rights and activism. And out of that, some of the members formed the National Gay Task Force, which is now the National LGBTQ Task Force, in 1973. So this is kind of representative of what was going on nationally in the path nationally. As I mentioned, Detroit voters included protections in its charter in the election of 1973. But the charter, the founding document of the city, still didn't have any teeth to it. They needed to enact an ordinance, and that took another 5 years for it to be enacted. But almost immediately, an activist named Brian McNaught wanted to utilize the charter protections that had just been passed because he had come out as a founder of this gay Catholic organization called Dignity, the Detroit chapter. He came out in the Detroit News, and he had been the youth columnist for the Michigan Catholic and was immediately suspended from his column. He was still kept on as a reporter, but his column was taken away. And he appeared on Gaily Speaking shortly thereafter, and this is kind of his account from that broadcast of what happened.
Brian McNaught, for 4 years, was a columnist for the Weekly Michigan Catholic, but he is no longer. He was removed from that column and reassigned to other staff work on July 8th, 2 days after coming out publicly through an article by Nancy Manser, which appeared in the Detroit News. The news article described local religious groups oriented toward gays, and Brian was interviewed as president of Detroit's chapter of Dignity, a group for gay Catholics. The action taken against Brian McNaught by the Michigan Catholic occurred quite clearly because he is gay, and more important, because he dared to come out publicly. Officially, said his editor, Margaret Cronin, "We'll say that we're dropping your column because of space limitations, but I know you want me to be honest with you, and it's just too controversial." Later, she described his column as morally unacceptable and detrimental to the well-being of the paper. But now here's Brian to describe himself, his response to this attack.
I told her immediately that I would fight her on it, that she didn't have grounds to do it. Her reaction was that as editor she had the right to drop anything out of the paper that she wanted to, and I said no, that I felt the new city charter protected people because of their sexual orientation, and that was clearly why she was doing it, and that I had a witness. There have been a few things that have been confused. One, there was an article in the News and Free Press, both the following Thursday, talking about the fact that other columns have been dropped from the Michigan Catholic, but they were dropped on June 12th, a month prior, and they were all dropped at the same time. And at that time, I was assured that my column would be kept. On the same day, June 12th, a column that I wrote appeared on Gay Love, in which I challenged the church's position, stating basically I thought it was inhuman and archaic, and encouraged the church to renew its stand. But and we had about 30 bad letters on that column. But there was no indication from the diocese or from the editorial staff that that column was going to be the source of any kind of rebuttal, or they were going to take any action. They had just presumed we would go on. I printed 3 columns after that, but it was the first working day after Nancy identified me in the news as a gay that they dropped the column.
So in protest, Brian went on a hunger strike, and this is a photo from the Detroit News of activists kind of protesting the Detroit Chancery on his behalf. And he ultimately got a kind of conciliatory response of some kind from the Detroit Archdiocese. And the auxiliary bishop expressed the idea that gay people did deserve civil rights. So Detroit, unlike, say, Chicago or New York, never had the level of Catholic opposition to enacting an ordinance that those other places did. Kind of also in line of kind of this vein of pursuing gay rights, David Crumroy was a person who became involved in gay activism after he was arrested in Hines Park. He founded a newspaper called Metro Gay News, which was more mainstream oriented and encompassed not just gay politics, but the gay bar scene and gay life in general. He was kind of a public presence in the community. And this is a photo of his commitment ceremony with his longtime partner at the Metropolitan Community Church in 1977 with Reverend Nancy Wilson, who was the pastor of the church, kind of conducting the service. So we've got kind of some early mainstreaming of kind of gay life and gay rights and the gay movement. And also out of Crumroy's arrest and the arrest of several other people, there was a group called the Association of Suburban People that was formed that I will note doesn't mention that it's a gay group and doesn't mention that it's related or anywhere near Detroit. So kind of those two dissociations are kind of important. But they kind of served as both a social group and a political group, and they were pursuing kind of traditional lobbying and that kind of thing. So this is happening out of Gay Lib. This is the first major organization after Gay Lib kind of founders. They ended up with mailing lists of hundreds of people. And then out of Metropolitan Community Church of Detroit, a group called the Detroit Coalition of Black Gays was formed by Reverend Renee McCoy here, who was a student chaplain for the church. And then Sylvia Robinson, who had been appointed by Mayor Coleman Young as his liaison to the gay community. So they started a group specifically for black gays in the city. And I love this little line, if you have to ask, you need to come. And this lasted until the late 1980s, and then Reverend McCoy also later formed Full Truth Fellowship Church, which is still operating, and she became a major mover and shaker with establishing a specifically black LGBTQ politics and culture within the city. And this was kind of a very formative group. And then in terms of kind of trans activism and organizing, a group called Crossroads was originally founded in Flint and later moved to Metro Detroit by Grace Bacon, who was a founder and co-director, and initially started as a group for cross-dressers. And at the time of the group's founding, Grace worked at Buick in Flint and wore a dress to their Halloween party and was fully like embraced, and people were fine with that. And then she wore a dress to the Christmas party, and they weren't quite so approving. But she went on to form Crossroads. They did class visits and met at universities students and talked about kind of what it's like to have her experience. And I interviewed Grace a couple years ago, and at age 76, she had gone from being married and seeing herself as heterosexual to identifying as trans and looking forward to gender confirmation surgery, and was racing to get it done while the Affordable Care Act might still cover it. So in her 70s, she has had now gender affirmation surgery. So I'm going to race through this next stuff because it's kind of everything I've talked about so far kind of forms the foundation for what we have now, but I want to kind of connect the dots a little bit with Anita Bryant, who in 1977, she had been a runner-up for Miss America. I just saw something on a video clip that said she was Miss America. She was runner-up. She was Miss Oklahoma. But she was also the spokesperson for the Florida Citrus Council, and I remember her as a kid. You know, she's singing to this cartoon birdie about, you know, drinking your orange juice. And in 1977, she came out forcefully against the Miami-Dade County ordinance that would protect people on the basis of sexual orientation, with a campaign, with a crusade called Save Our Children, beating on all kinds of stereotypes and tropes about queer people being predators, and successfully engineered the repeal of the ordinance in Dade County. And then she went on to Eugene, Oregon, to Wichita, Kansas, and St. Paul, Minnesota, and got the ordinances repealed there too. In Detroit, one of the guys I interviewed for my initial research as an undergrad, named Stuart Itzkowitz. We had this great 2-hour interview, and at the end of the interview, he said, "Oh, I by the way, I kept a diary. Would you be interested?" So he loaned me his diary. Like, he kept it from 72 to 85, and what a rich document it is. And the day of this ordinance being repealed, I mean, it's just a heartbreaking entry. He just feels like he's doomed. But people like Nancy Wilson were around, and David Cornroy, activists, and they were adamant that in Michigan, we were going to take a stand. And this led to the formation of the Michigan Organization for Human Rights in 1977. Don Major was a longtime activist involved in Gay Lib, one of the members of the Gay Radio Collective that started Gaily Speaking. Sal Connor was from Grand Rapids. She was a postal worker and had started a Monday night discussion group for queer people. Reddy Schreiber was just involved in bar life, but also kind of this musical troupe called the Butterflies. And then this guy was a guy named Christopher Flynn, who taught dance at the University of Michigan and had been a dance instructor in Rochester, where one of his students was Madonna. And he's the one that took Madonna to Menjo's and kind of exposed Madonna to gay life. But what people don't remember about Christopher Flynn, they remember this kind of aspect of him being involved in dance and music and disco and whatnot. But he was a founding officer of this major LGBTQ civil rights organization in Michigan. And Moore, you know, served as kind of the basis. Later, Affirmations Community Center came out of Moore, as did the Triangle Foundation, which is now known as Equality Michigan. Kind of separate, but kind of out of Affirmations, grew Transgender Michigan. And then since 1996, soon to celebrate its 25th anniversary, there's been an African-American queer celebration, LGBTQ celebration, called Hotter Than July, that has been sponsored by a coalition of African-American specific LGBT organizations. And I'll kind of close out kind of the final ripples can still be seen on college campuses as well. And both of these photos are from this year's. This is the Lavender graduation that was held that Esther Newton keynoted this past April. And Wayne State had its own rainbow graduation ceremony in the spring as well, as did 6 other campuses, including Ferris and Western and Eastern. I'm sorry? This is U of M. This is in their new student center, or Trotter House, right? The Trotter. And then this is at Wayne. So I ran a little long, 10 minutes past, but I'm happy to do some Q&A.
This program was recorded on June 22nd, 2019 at the Ann Arbor District Library.